my name is Sive, and I'm going to be your host for the whole week for primary schools. Some of you probably have seen me already. So today's session is all about Climate Change 101, and we're going to be doing it with the lovely Claudio, who works here with us at ECO-UNESCO. So first of all, I should say who ECO-UNESCO are. We are a youth organisation. We were founded back in 1986 by a group of young people, and our aim is to empower young people who are involved with us to help protect our environment. We're proud to be one of UNESCO's affiliated clubs and a Sustainable Development Goals ambassador. We're a youth organisation and we focus primarily on environmental education and empowering young people. And we try and facilitate young people to develop the skills they need to protect their environment. So like I said, today's session is called Climate Change 101 with the lovely Claudio. So we're going to learn all about SDG 13, which is about climate action in this Eco Week session. So I'm going to hand over to Claudio now.
Yeah, thank you, Saif. Hi, everyone. How's it going? Yeah, can you all hear me? Yeah. Good to go. Yeah, can I go, Saif? Okay, can you see the screen? Yep. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thank you, Saif, for the introduction, and thank you for having the possibility of being here with you today. My name's Claudio. I've been working for ECO-UNESCO a bit of time for the last 2 years. Just two infos about me. I have a background in geography, and then I studied climate change here at Maynooth University. I've been in Ireland for the last 4 years, and I enjoy the Irish weather and the Irish people very much, so I'll be hanging around for the next couple of years, I bet. So we're going to have it's very difficult to sum up climate change in 45 minutes. We'll try it. So anytime you have any questions, please write it in chat, or you can unmute yourselves, and we will try and have a wonderful 45 minutes kind of interactive. So a bit of physics. It won't be too much of a physics class, and then we will see a bit about the human perspective of how climate change impacts people daily at a human level. So weather or climate, this is the big thing. So can someone tell me which is weather and which is climate for the two images? You can unmute yourself, or you can write it in the chat, and Saif can read. So which would be weather and which would be climate? You can have a guess. Have any attempts in chat?
Yep. Third class in Staple and ETNS say weather is the one on the map.
Yeah.
Weather's on the left. The left is weather, right is climate. That's basically what we're getting.
Yeah, grand, that's it. So we have weather, that is the Irish map, so a lovely map by Met Erin, and then we have climate. So what is the difference? So weather basically is the conditions that we have this moment in your specific place. So I guess I'm based in Dublin 2. If your school is in Dublin 6, in Dublin 8, you'll probably have different weather conditions than the ones I'm experiencing right now. So, and also weather changes very rapidly, especially here in Ireland. I got to know that your favorite topic to talk about during the day is how weather changes, because you can experience 4 or 5 different weathers throughout the day. It's not so much the same where I come from in Italy. We kind of have the same weather throughout the day, except maybe there are some exceptions, but here in Ireland you have very different, you can experience very different weather conditions throughout the day. On the other hand, climate is something of a bit more kind of a long duration throughout time and also throughout the space. So when we think of climate, we don't have to think anymore about minutes. So it's not 10 or 15 minutes, it's not a day, it's not a week, it's not a month, it's decades, it's hundreds of years, it's thousands of years. And so the big difference between weather or climate, so it's the duration in time and also the location in space. So here it's the climate map. This was developed by some researcher in university. And so if you've been abroad, you will see that you will have very different climatic conditions from Ireland. So Ireland, if you see it, it's this very kind of light green. And you have a similar kind of color in the British Isles, so even in the UK. And then you have also the same kind of temperate conditions in the northern part of France and in Germany. But then if you go down, the more south you go, so like Italy, Spain, France, you start having kind of shades of yellow and orange. That means that the climate there is different, especially in the Mediterranean region. You have hotter summers, you have winter that are less rigid and with less rain, but then you have snow that is something that can be found throughout Europe, especially in mainland. So it's normal to have different climatic conditions, and this is useful also to classify the regions. So I think you've all studied that there are areas of the world that we kind of consider to be deserts, which are very, very harsh. So if you consider like the red areas of Africa, where the Sahara Desert is, or the Arabic Peninsula, or the desert in Australia, those are areas where we know there are some climatic conditions that can be very, very hostile for people and for animals. So the climate changes depending on the location, but you can see it's very, very wide, I mean, the climatic areas. And this is useful just to classify the different types of climate that we have on the planet. But then we have the climate change. So the climate is changing. We know that it's changing. This is a kind of the very useful way of visualizing how climate is changing. It's very intuitive. So you have two colors, the red and the blue. The blue means that you have cold conditions, and the red means you have hotter conditions. Based on what? Based on a time frame, so 1961, 2010, that is kind of the time frame that we use for reference, and then we say, was that year hotter or was that year colder compared to the 1961, 2010? Just look at the last two ones. The last two is 2023 and 2022. We have very, very intense and vivid red. These were the two hottest years of record in Ireland and in the world. And so immediately we can see that compared to 1961, 2010, so a time frame of more or less 50 years, we had the two hottest years on records in 2022 and 2023. Then we have 2003. A lot of you maybe weren't around in 2003. I was. This means I'm a bit old now. 2003 was a very, very warm year, especially in Europe. And so we have 2003, 2022, and 2023. This shows us that the climate is warming, that climate change is happening. Just for notice, we go back to 1850 because that is where the Industrial Revolution began. So that is where we started polluting a lot into the atmosphere. That is when we started to have machines. That is when we started to build coal in our houses. That is where we started to build in factories. And we started to have also farming at an extensive, intensive level. So 1850 is where we began actually to have a comparison of how the temperatures are rising in time. And so just for reference, 2023 was the second hottest consecutive year with 1.65 degrees above the average. My experience, I've been in Ireland for the last 4 years, is that the summer of 2022 and 2023 were extremely warm. We had very, very warm spells. We had a bit of rain, not too much compared to what would be the average expected in Ireland, but definitely, I mean, maybe you can say that as well. They've been very, very warm. We had some very kind of warm days, warm spells, temperature rising to 26, 27 degrees. It was also very difficult to sleep at night here in Dublin, especially where we have maybe a heat wave effect given the massive construction that we have. And so here, one of my favorite shows, Big Bang Theory, just a little bit of physics, won't go too much into depth. If you have any questions, just raise your hands or stop me at any time. I hope you like the Big Bang Theory, and we have some fans in the audience as well. So now what I'm going to ask you is just to cover your nose and your mouth and to breathe 5 times. So what did you experience? Was the air warm within? Or it's something that you can do when we were wearing the mask. So we experienced that the air, when we breathe and we cover our mouth and our nose, is usually warmer compared to the one outside. This is because we release some heat particles that then get trapped into our hands. And this is very useful. I think it's quite intuitive also to help us to understand the greenhouse effect. So if you've been to a greenhouse, I hope you had, I know there are some loads of schools that have a greenhouse in their backyards. They're extremely useful. They help us to kind of grow throughout the year crops that that we wouldn't actually grow in normal conditions. And how do they do so? They do so because they trap the heat. How do they trap heat? They trap the heat from the sun that comes into the atmosphere with radiation. So we have energy coming in. The energy gets absorbed by the plants, and the plants then release the heat slowly, but the heat gets trapped into the greenhouse. So if you enter a greenhouse, even in the winter, did it go off?
Yeah, we can't see your slides now, Claudio. Oh, I can see them now.
Can you see them now? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Apologies. So even if you go into a greenhouse during the winter, you will find that there is always 2 or 3 degrees warmer compared to the outside temperature. That's because the plants release energy, release heat throughout the time, and this heat gets trapped into the greenhouse that is usually built of hard plastic or of glass. And so the same concept, we can apply it to the atmosphere. And so that is why we say that there is a greenhouse effect. So the greenhouse effect, which is not negative, it's actually positive, because it helps us, it sustains life and enables life to be on Earth. Because otherwise, without the greenhouse effect, we would have an average temperature of the Earth of minus 18 degrees Celsius. So the greenhouse effect is actually positive because it sustains life. It helps us to live. Otherwise, we would be freezing at minus 20 degrees. So what the greenhouse effect, here is the image on the right. We have the clouds. And so the clouds kind of trap the heat that is released by the surface. They trap it in the lower levels of the atmosphere, and they enable us to keep a temperature that is in average around, that helps us to sustain and helps plants to live. But on the other hand, we know that we can emit some negative greenhouse gases that then they kick off a negative greenhouse effect, because you have to imagine that we always have to keep a balance. The Earth is always into a balance, and this balance sustains life. If we introduce some negative kind of feedback, then we will have an imbalanced kind of system, and that is where we are actually reaching, and this is why it's actually a concern. It's been a concern in the last decades, the greenhouse effect and the emission of pollutions. So what are greenhouse gases? Can anyone name a greenhouse gas? I think this image could help figure out or imagine what a greenhouse gas is. You can unmute, or you can just write in chat, and then Saib would be reading out. Any example of what you think a greenhouse gas is?
We have some coming in already, Claudio. Methane, from Donna Fallon's group. Ray McDonough's group say CO2.
Yeah, great.
Carbon dioxide. Emissions from cows. Methane.
Yeah, great.
Jerry say methane.
Yep, great. Yeah, methane. Yeah, methane and carbon dioxide, 2 very, very important greenhouse gases. So yeah, we have them here. We have CO2, carbon dioxide, we have CH4, methane, then we have nitrous oxide, and then we have other kind of fluorinated gases. The most important one is H2O, is actually water. So water particles are the ones that make up the clouds. They are actually also a greenhouse gas, because the heat waves, the heat radiation that is emitted from the surface links to the greenhouse gases and to water particles and stays into the atmospheres and enables the formation of clouds. So actually also H2O, it's a greenhouse gas. The difference between H2O and the other gases is the lifespan. H2O has a very, very short lifespan compared to the other gases. CO2, CH4, they live into the atmosphere for decades, sometimes centuries for other gases. And that's why they're particularly kind of dangerous for the atmosphere. So as I said, when the surface of the Earth releases the heat particles, they link to the greenhouse gases and they stay within the atmosphere. They don't go in the upper layers of the atmosphere. And that is why we have a greenhouse effect, because then they stay in the atmosphere, they come down towards the lower layers of the surface and they heat the lower surface of the atmosphere. That is where we actually live. And so that is why we have temperatures rising at a global level, because these particles, these heat particles, they link to greenhouse gases, they stay in the lower layers of the atmosphere and they heat the lower layers of the atmosphere, and that is why we have an increase in global temperatures. Just for reference, this is a global kind of image of how temperatures have risen since 1850, and then on the right side you have an increase in carbon dioxide emissions. So you see that for an increase in emissions of carbon dioxide, we have an increase in global temperature rise. So there's actually a link that has been proven now in the past decades. It's something that science was aware since the 1960s, 1970s. There have been studies conducted, but it's something that has been especially proved since the 1990s, that for an increase in the emissions of especially CO2 and even methane, so NH4, especially with agriculture and farming, we have an increase in global temperature rise at a global level, surface and also ocean temperature rise. So now we have over 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I think that it's kind of threatening. I've traveled back home in Italy. Italy has one of the most polluted areas in Europe, especially the northern part of Italy where Milan is. And if you look at maps, there are days in the winter when the area is so polluted that the government and the local authorities are ask people not to go out and not to do outdoor activities like in China or in India. So you have a concentration of emissions and a concentration of particles of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases that is so high that you actually ask not to do outdoor activities. So you cannot go out for a run, you cannot go out for a walk, you have to stay inside and wear a mask if you go outside. So it's frightening for me that it's kind of levels are getting so high that you have to kind of be careful of what you're doing. It's not something that we're experiencing here in Ireland, but yeah, it's something that definitely is coming in Europe as well. So briefly, the impacts of climate change. When we talk about the impacts, we have to think about the tragedy of the commons. It's a very kind of quick and easy concept to understand. So if I have a piece of land and I know that I have a capacity that I can have 20 cows on the land, and I know that if that piece of land would sustain me having 20 cows on the land, I'm okay with that. But if I get greedy and I increase the number of cows that I have on the same kind of amount of land, then what I will do, I will reach a tipping point. I will reach a tipping point where the amount of land, where the land catchment cannot sustain anymore the number of cows that I'm increasing constantly. And so I will reach a tipping point where actually the resource will be depleted. The resource will be consumed. I will not be able to sustain the life of this amount of cows anymore. And that's something that we are kind of reaching. We're reaching actually a tipping point, which is kind of an interesting concept that you can apply in science, in geography, but also kind of in your kind of or in your daily life. So how much actually can you sustain? Even if you grow kind of veggies in your background, you know that you can plant just a certain amount of tomatoes or of zucchini or of lettuce in a garden patch. And so if you plant more because you get greedy or because you like the vegetables, then you will see quite quickly that the harvest that you will get will not be the same. There will be a depletion of the resource because the soil is not able to give the nutrients anymore to an increase in plants. And that's something that is going on. I mean, we are kind of continuing in kind of depleting and consuming natural resources, and also with kind of a knock-on effect on the climate and the amount of gases that we are emitting at a global level. The impacts of climate change. So we've been talking a bit about the physical science and what is climate change and how this happens. And now we have the impact. So these are three kind of three interesting images. So the first one on the right is a comparison of a place here in County Wicklow in Courtown, which is near Gorey. Here you see a huge difference between the 1980s, where you have a beautiful beach, people that are enjoying the beach, activities, leisure, something that you will normally do during the summer. And this is a picture that I took last year. I was there for a research trip with the university. And now you can see that the same stretch of the beach is absolutely totally covered in rocks in order to prevent erosion, coastal erosion, and then you have a rise in sea level. And so one of the most clear and most immediate impacts of climate change is sea level rise, which is happening in different locations. Here in Ireland, it's happening in the US, it's happening in Bangladesh, it's happening in many, many places. Here in Ireland, it's particularly important because you have coastal erosion. We have, especially here in the eastern part, you have these lovely sandy beaches with lovely dunes, which are very, very kind of prone to coastal erosion. So that is one of the most kind of immediate effects of climate change that you can see, even just some kilometers from home. The second image that is on the bottom, sorry, left, is being taken actually a few days ago, and it's another flooding that has happened in my country, in Italy. It's kind of representative because this is an area that usually wasn't hit by floods. It's been hit by two major floods in the last 2 years. So floods that usually wouldn't happen in 100 years happened twice in 2023 and in 2024. So imagine what is the impact of having entire areas, cities, towns flooded for months. So the flood in 2023, it took weeks for the soil to absorb that amount of rain. Even now, there has been increasing flooding and damaging with a storm Boris in Central Europe, in the Czech Republic, and in Hungary. And so imagine the soil isn't ready, to get that amount of rain like in 6 or 8 hours. Because you imagine the amount of rain that should actually be absorbed in 1 year, in 6 months, flashes down in 8 hours, 12 hours, 1 day. And so the soil gets a capacity where it cannot absorb anymore. And so the rain, then the water has to find a way out. And then that is where floods happen. And then that's where we have damages to infrastructure, to people, and the livelihoods are affected. The other image is from Brazil. And now we've had increase, even this year, we have an increase in wildfires in Brazil. So it's common kind of idea that wildfires aren't caused by climate change. But actually what happens, climate change...
You are on mute. Hello.
I'm on mute.
Did they just block us?
I'm on mute, Saif. You can hear me?
No, you're okay, Claudia. Keep
Okay. So you can see here that climate change prepares the soil for wildfires because the decrease in the average amount of rain and an increase in temperatures makes the vegetation prone to catch fire very easily. Even naturally, they don't need a human kind of hand. In some cases, also human help this by actually voluntarily kind of causing fires for burning the ground and preparing the ground maybe for crops or for cattle. But in some cases you have actually natural kind of causes of wildfires but are prepared by climate change because you have lower than average rainfall in the area in the Amazon, and then you have an increase in temperature, and so the vegetation can immediately act as combustion for wildfires. So a couple of myths about climate change. If we have to kind of do a fact checking about climate change. So climate change has always happened, so you should not worry about it. True and not true. Climate change has happened throughout centuries. If you study dinosaurs, we know that at the time the dinosaurs were around, the Earth was extremely, extremely warm. So climate change, the climate of the Earth has changed throughout the centuries, has changed throughout the millions of years, but this doesn't mean that it has to change in 50 years, in 40 years. So the natural change that has occurred of the climate of the Earth is something that is true, but the degree and the extent and the amount of change that has happened in the last 50 years is not something that is natural. It's something that is induced by human activity. And so we go to the second kind of point. climate change is a natural process, it has nothing to do with people. That's not true. Science says that, as I showed you, an increase in the emissions and in the parts per million of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases leads to an increase in temperatures at a global level. A couple of degrees of warming is not that big of a deal. Yeah, there have been people that went out also on television, also in my country, saying, look, you have to enjoy a warm summer. You have to go to the beach. It's 35, it's 40 degrees. That's good. Not really. What is the impact of 2 degrees? What is the impact on agriculture? What is the impact on cattle? What is the impact of people that live without air conditioning in countries like Italy and Spain? How can you stay a day when the temperature is constantly around 35, 40 degrees in home without air conditioning? So 2 degrees actually have a huge impact. And then we have also the impact on the system. So what is the knock-on effect of 2 degrees of rise at a global level on the Earth system? An increase in cold snaps shows climate change is not real. So in the last years we have, especially in the winter, here in Ireland as well, we've had snow in February last year. That was very nice. We went out, we played a bit, but also we had very kind of harsh conditions, cold conditions in the US and in Canada. And so people say, look, it's cold, so climate change is not happening. But that's actually not true. That actually proves that climate change is happening. Because when we have very cold kind of events, it means that there is an imbalance in the amount of energy that there is in the atmosphere. And so cold kind of snaps from the north, from the Arctic regions, come down and hit areas that usually wouldn't be kind of hit by these very, very cold events. And so even the snow here in Ireland, is actually a symptom and it's actually a clue that climate change is happening. We don't need to worry about lowering greenhouse gas emissions. Humanity is inventive. We can just adapt to climate change. So there have been many kind of research and many projects on how we can adapt to climate change without actually lowering emissions. And there have been massive projects on carbon capture. There have been massive projects of kind of adapting infrastructure at a global level to climate change. But actually, is that true? Can we actually imagine ourselves in 100 years, in 50 years, living in the conditions that we're actually prospecting the Earth to be without actually lowering and putting on hold to greenhouse gas emissions? Imagine also that the emissions that we are actually putting into the atmosphere today, they will stay in the atmosphere for the next decades. So the effects will be actually seen and experienced in the next decades. So the more emissions we put in the atmosphere, the more kind of effects we will have in the next couple of generations. And the last one is just very simple. Scientists disagree on the cause of climate change. Even now we have politicians that say that there is no consensus. That's not true. If you consider the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we have over 600 scientists, we have universities, we have research bodies, we have academics that go through thousands of research pieces, articles, news articles, and they go through and they fact check the science and they prove that the science there is a consensus that climate change is happening and is actually caused by humans. Am I on time, Saif? Yeah. So climate change and what are the impacts for people? So when we talk about climate justice, that is a kind of a more human perspective concept when we consider climate change. We have to think of the effects that climate change has on people. So I will not be impacted by climate change the same as yourselves. I will not be impacted by climate change the same as my mom that's living in Italy. I will not be impacted by climate change the same as a person that is living in Brazil or in Bangladesh or in the Philippines. There is a huge difference in how we are actually impacted by climate change. And these differences are based on multiple factors. Here are just a few. Location. So as I said, Ireland, Dublin is impacted by climate change in a way. Galway in County Wicklow is impacted by climate change in another way. A town in the Philippines with huge kind of coastal erosion and sea level rise will be impacted by climate change in a different way. And so location is very, very important. Income. Why is income important? Because I can adapt to climate change in a different way. If I live in Italy and summers tend to be extreme with temperatures that go over 40 degrees, I probably will need to fit my bedroom with air conditioning. But what if I can't afford air conditioning? What if in the next 10 or 15 years, we will have to fit every home in Ireland with air conditioning because summers will get too hot and we don't have the insulation in the houses? And what if you can't afford air conditioning? So income is a huge factor in this. Even if you think of coastal erosion, what if you have a house that is next to the sea? And what if the government comes and says, look, you have to relocate? But what if you don't have the money to relocate? That's a huge factor that we have to consider. Gender. Boys, girls, women, men, they are impacted by climate change in a huge different way, especially when we think of kids that have to go to school. And so what's the difference between, especially in countries, kind of in the least developed countries or in developed countries, where we have girls that are out of school, they are staying at home, they're helping the family, or they're working. And so how climate change impacts them as well. And then we have class. So class, it's very linked to income in some countries. Then we have race or ethnicity. So how are people from different ethnicities impacted by climate change in certain countries, especially in countries maybe in, like if you consider the US, where you have people of different ethnicity living in different areas, and maybe people with certain people of certain ethnicities are kind of more vulnerable to climate change. Age is a factor. How are old people impacted? How can old people cope with extreme temperatures during the summer? Or how can old people cope with extreme cold conditions during the winter if they're not able to properly heat their apartments and if they don't have availability of income and resources? And then you have the level of education. Education is key. Even being here, even talking about climate change and sustainability for SDG week, for this week, it's extremely important because it gives you the tools to kind of understand what's going on, to get a perception of what's going on, and to try and develop not only your own idea, but also to develop kind of a coping tools in order to cope with climate change in the next year, in the next decades. And so it's extremely important, the difference in the level of education on how you're impacted by climate change. Then you have disability or other personal characteristics. I mean, there are some characteristics that identify you as a person. You're unique for those characteristics, but at the same time, you kind of could be prone to impact by climate change more than other people, and so we have to also consider that. So it's not easy to say we will all be impacted at the same extent by climate change. It would be very, very different based on all of these characteristics and also other ones that I haven't mentioned here.
Claudio?
Yeah.
You just have 5 minutes left, okay?
Okay, I'll try and rush. So what human rights do you think are impacted by climate change? Can anyone throw a couple of ideas in the chat? Have any answers, Saif?
Just give us a minute. We'll wait and see what happens. Access to water, we have a group saying.
Water.
The right to life.
Right to life. Great.
Right to work in decent conditions.
Absolutely.
Right to being healthy.
Right to being healthy, yeah.
Right to sanitation, health, housing, access to clean water, education, to feel safe.
A lot, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's you've nailed them. I mean, you've included them all into your answers. Thank you very much. So we have the right to life, which is the first one on the top left, and so people impacted by climate change see that their right to life is actually threatened, because if you think of people that live in areas where we have an increase in typhoons, we have an increase in extreme heat waves, their right to life is actually threatened. At the same way, their right to a health and well-being, it's impacted by climate change. Someone said the right to housing. Thank you very much. Housing is kind of the most important right that enables us to enjoy our life, and then enables us to have a different kind of rights: education, right to food, right to work. So not having a house because we are impacted by climate change, it's a violation of a key right that then has a knock-off effect on many different rights. You've put the water and sanitation, definitely. I mean, especially in areas where people are actually sent away from their homes, they are displaced from their areas internally, or they have to flee their countries. You see that the right to water and sanitation can be actually threatened and be at risk. The right to food, especially in those areas where we have a decrease in the level of crops. This has been now in Africa, in the Horn of Africa, where there's been a kind of a emergency for the crops harvest that has been below average for many years now. Then we have the right to an environment, to a safe environment. Obviously, living in an environment where we are hit and we are struck by climate change actually threatens the environment and our well-being very much. And then we have also the right to non-discrimination, which is the one here on the bottom left. So people that have to flee their home, that are internally displaced, or actually are refugees, so they leave their country, they can be at risk of being discriminated. And so how climate change impacts this is very important. And all it comes to the right to determination. So the right of being ourselves, being who we are, and enjoying our rights is an existential right, and it is actually threatened by climate change to a very serious extent. I'll just run through the slide and then we'll open it to questions. So for me, it's very important to give a human rights perspective, and also to mention activists and human rights defenders that have kind of dedicated their lives, and they're still kind of dedicating their lives and making their mission to protect the environment and to raising their voice for climate change. So we have, on the top, we have Greta Thunberg, that started the Fridays for Future movement in 2018, and now has become kind of a global kind of icon on climate change and environmental rights, not only for our generation, but I think it's kind of been a very cross-generational movement. The other ones are a bit not so famous, but I think they are still very important. So we have, in the middle, we have Nolin Butuma. She's a South African activist. She has dedicated her life to protecting local communities in South Africa that were threatened by mining companies which were doing offshore kind of tests for mining and for for oil, and she protected local communities, and she won the Goldman Prize, which is kind of the Nobel Prize for environmental defenders. Then we have 3 human rights defenders that have given also their life for protecting the environment. Chico Mendes, here in the middle, he was a Brazilian activist for protecting the Amazon. Then we have Kensaro Weaver from Nigeria. He fought against Shell, the oil company, that has displaced and has ruined the environment in the Delta Niger in Nigeria. And then we have Berta Cáceres, which is on the bottom of the left, and she's from Ecuador, and she has been fighting against governments and companies that wanted to deplete the national environment and indigenous communities in the Ecuador. And now her daughter Bertita Cáceres, she's taking on the fight of the mom. So you see, you have human rights defenders and activists are very important. And just to kind of end on this, and it's something that I want to leave you with, is that taking a stand for climate change and climate justice is something that everyone can do. So think of climate change and think of climate change banners that you can design yourself, and you can take a stand with a very kind of powerful and potent message for climate change. How do you feel about climate change? How can we make a change about climate change? What do we want to ask people that have the power? What is our message for the earth? So I just want to leave you with this. Think about this in class at home. Write a message. Feel free to send it to us. we will kind of share it on our social media accounts throughout the week. Hope it
Thanks
was
so
on
much,
time,
Claudio.
Saif. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a great talk. I'm going to skip to the questions after. I just want to say my piece first, just because we are running a bit short on time. And then we can stay for questions after, if that's okay with everybody. So first of all, I'd like everyone to send into the chat. I've put it in there already, but I've only seen 3 responses. The name of their school and how many students are attending. It's just very important for us for funding and stuff like that. So if you haven't done so already, please send in the name of your school and how many young people are watching today. And once you have that done, we also have a form you can fill in. Again, these are very important things for funding. We get to run stuff like Eco Week and lots of workshops and other things for free because of the funding that we get. And we get that funding through feedback form and attendance to our events. So if you could please send in where you're calling in from and how many kids you have in the room with you, that would be really, really helpful. And the feedback form we can send around afterwards as well if you don't get a chance to do it today. I see some great ones coming in already. So thanks so much for sending in your school and how many young people are watching. So we have lots of things that we do at ECO-UNESCO, and I just want to highlight a few of them. One of the big ones that you guys can enter as primary school kids is Young Environmentalist Awards. So if any of the talks this week, especially Claudio's talk, have inspired you to do maybe some action of your own, then you can enter into our competition where you do an action project. And we have our big final in May. So if you want to learn more about the Young Environmentalist Awards, please have a look at our website. There's loads of information on there as well. We also provide workshops in school. So myself or my lovely colleague Katie will come to your school and deliver a workshop about a range of different topics, all of which again are on our website. So if you want to have a look. And we run loads of youth groups as well. So if you're in the Dublin area, Drogheda, Galway, Maynooth, there's youth clubs you can join, or you can join Claudio's Youth Climate Justice Programme maybe when you get a bit older. So Eco Week this week, we have a couple of more talks coming up. So later on today for our primary school age kids, we have biodiversity and our forest, which is a talk by Quilcha and Pat Neville. And we have loads more talks this week. There's loads of time to still sign up. So if you are interested in any of the other talks, you can find this little calendar on our social medias and on our website. And the Eventbrite links are all still open. So if you wish to enter, please do. And here is all the contact information for ECO-UNESCO. So if you want to book a workshop or just ask more questions about resources and stuff like that, please give us a call or an email. info@ECO-UNESCO is the general one. I can send my personal email into the chat as well. If anyone wants to book a workshop with me, that would be great. But if any other information is all on our website and our social media. So if you're interested, please have a look there. Now, we have 1 minute left. So let's get to Claudio's questions and see if anyone has any questions. So please either raise your hand and send your question in, or write it into the group chat.
Okay, yeah, I see a question on AstroTurf. So yeah, AstroTurf, the material that it's used is usually recycled from tires that they use it. So it's an upcycled materials. That's not negative. Environmentally, it is negative because if you there's a huge difference. I mean, if you consider a football pitch, it's 110 meters per 50, and imagine the difference in the amount of energy it can capture if it's actual grass or if it's AstroTurf. The AstroTurf will just reflect the energy back into the atmosphere, and so contributing again to the increase in temperatures. And so the more kind of natural kind of surfaces we have, like grass actually or soil, that's positive for the environment. So the every kind of amount of even centimeters of meters that we kind of build up with cement or other kind of non-natural kind of construction, that's definitely negative. And then on AstroTurf, there are also some health issues with the material. Yeah.
We have a hand up in Miss Fallon's classroom. Do you guys want to ask a question? Just want to unmute yourselves there and ask.
Would it be better to have no greenhouse gases at all, or the amount we have today?
didn't hear you so well. I think, yeah.
Yeah, maybe just move closer to the laptop there and we'll hear you a bit better.
Would it be better to have no greenhouse gases at all or have the amount we have today?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, it's a very good question. So as I mentioned, we need a bit of greenhouse gases because otherwise the temperature of the Earth, of the atmosphere, will be minus 18 degrees, and we cannot live in a freezer. So we need a bit of greenhouse gases. Definitely the amount of greenhouse gases that we've had now for the past 50 years is too much. So we need to go back to that amount that we had before, the industrialization, so before 150 years ago. So we need a good amount because otherwise we wouldn't be able to live and we wouldn't be able to have life on our planet. But definitely the amount of greenhouse gases that we have now is exceeding the natural levels. Thank you for the question, by the way.
Thank you.
I can hear you, sorry, I think you're muted.
Apologies. We have one more question in the chat.
Yeah.
What is one thing we can do today to help?
Oh, that's a good one. I think definitely education and kind of awareness raising at even at a local level, at home, in your school, in your community, with friends is important. So raising awareness within your kind of your community of peers, of friends, your family, it's extremely important. I mean, and imagine in the future, even just talking with your parents, that they will have the possibility to vote. Maybe in the next months we have general elections coming up here in Ireland. That's extremely important. Just to have a chat, just to have a talk, just to speak with people about climate change, what's going on, and what we heard, what we know, and to inform ourselves. That's definitely important. Yeah.
Thanks, Claudio. We have two more questions if you have the
Yeah.
time to stick around.
Yeah.
What is the impact of big corporations on our environment?
Well, the impact of big corporations is just it's quite clear. I mean, they are the most important emitters of pollutants at a global level, and so they definitely I mean, we have governments that try to shift. I mean, the focus on actions of individuals, which I want to say it's important that we, I mean, act responsibly and we act respecting the environment. But on the other hand, we know that a single corporation emits for 100,000 people, a million people. And so definitely the impact of big corporations, especially those corporations that are actually involved in kind of dirty business like oil companies or big techs that even here in Ireland we have data centers that they kind of absorb a huge amount of energy. We know that those kind of corporations definitely have a big responsibility in the levels of CO2 that then are emitted into the atmosphere. And it's also, I mean, fair to say that corporations haven't taken a stand in the last years. There's been a lot of greenwashing. I don't know if you ever heard of this term. It's corporation kind of selling and rebranding themselves as being green, but actually they're not impacting and they're not actually making a big change into their business. They're just going on business as usual, but then they're maybe making some nice fancy ads that they're actually turned green and they're all sustainable.
Yeah, and then our final question for today, Claudio. Is there a specific reason why 2003 was a bad year compared to others?
Yeah, so 2003 was extremely bad in France. So it was the worst. We had the worst heat waves in France and in continental Europe. And so it's really you know, in Europe, especially in countries like France, Italy, Spain, Greece, it's a lot is from the African kind of the heat comes up from Africa, and so we have a system of very high pressure that kind of sends away all the kind of the clouds and the water, I mean, and then the rain. And so we have months of kind of very high pressure and heat that kind of stalls into the European continent, and that brings extensive heat waves and very kind of serious impacts also on health. And that's why 2003 was so bad. I mean, still up to 2022, it was the warmest summer that we had in Europe was 2003. And now it has just been, I mean, surpassed by 2022 and 2023. Thanks a million.
That's perfect, Claudio. Thanks so much. Thanks everybody for coming and joining our talk today. Like I said earlier, we've loads more talks. There's another one today and there's loads more during the week as well. So if there's anything else you want to see, all our events are free. So please sign up if you haven't already. With that said, I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks a million.
And I hope to see you another day this week.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.